First off, I want to tell you that mastery comes in two main domains. One is called personal mastery, and the other is called skills mastery. And it turns out that even outside of work, progressing towards mastery is very, very important for our happiness. We want to be competent, we want to be effective, we want to be well known for doing something. And even if that something is not paying us money, for example, we are a very good parent, or we are a very good knitter of sweaters, or we are very good at organizing tours for our friends to neighboring countries, for example. That gives us some satisfaction. Okay, so that is called skills mastery, and I'm going to get to skills mastery in a little bit in the next session. I want to really focus on personal mastery now. Personal mastery, in turn, falls into two groups. Mastery over your thoughts and feelings, which I've already talked about a little bit in the context of autonomy, gaining a little bit of control over your internal environment, your thoughts and feelings. But there's also a second domain of personal mastery that's called core values. Do you understand what your values are? Now, this begs the question of what do we mean by values? So values you can think of as the software that explains your thoughts, your attitudes, and your behaviors. It's like the operating system in a computer. You never really see the operating system. Likewise, you don't see people's values. You look at, you can see their behaviors. You can see perhaps their thoughts if they express them, and so on, but you don't really see their values that are underlying. But values are really more important because they drive everything else. They are the core from which everything else emanates. So they are like the bottom of the iceberg. 80% is hidden, so you can see the behavior, which is the top, but really it's being driven by what's at the bottom. So another way to picturize this is as follows. So you have your behaviors, which are on the outside. Then you have your attitudes, which are a little bit on the inside, sometimes unseen. And then you have your values, which are at the deepest level, which are often unseen, unless people actually express them, right? And when you know a person truly well, when you've gotten to know them intimately, it often means that you know what their values are, what they stand for, what's truly important to them. There is a survey called Character Strength Survey, and you can take it by going to a website called viasurvey.org. And if you put in your card in that bowl, we'll send you an email with that link, and you can take that. And if you take that survey, you'll be able to get a pretty good idea of what your character strengths are, which is really what your values are as well. But we're going to do a shorter exercise, which is, I think, somewhat more interesting. So the way that we're going to do this exercise, and the aim of the exercise is to arrive at your values, your top 3 values, is to start with who are your top 3 heroes. Now, all of you being Bulgarian, I'm pretty sure that Levski is going to be a hero for everybody here, right? This great freedom fighter. Perhaps for a very small crowd, I don't know how big the crowd is going to be, for the next picture I have here. Perhaps, okay, I see some heads that are shaking. All right, but for those who do admire Stoichkov as well, I'd like you to answer really 2 questions, okay? So, what are your top 3 heroes, and what do you admire about these 3 heroes? So, let me very quickly point to the figures I have here. So, perhaps courage for Levski, and you really admire that. Perhaps intelligence, right? He was not just a brave guy, he was a very smart guy. He tried to organize this grassroots movement across the whole of the country rather than doing it in only one place, which would have failed. As it turned out, luck did not favor him, but nevertheless, we can't deny that he was an extremely courageous and very, very smart individual. And perhaps with Stoichkov, to the extent that you do like him, you think of him as being authentic, that he really stood for whatever he believed in. Okay? And he was certainly very loyal to Bulgaria, right? He never really forgot where he came from. So you can identify those features. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. Okay, I want you to complete these 3 steps at this point. Who are your top 3 heroes? What do you admire about these top 3 heroes? And from that list, I want you to make the list of your top 3 values, and you can in fact work in that workbook. There is some space for it. So I have something very interesting that I want you to do now. Okay, it's the beginning of session 3 is on actually what's called shadow values. Okay, so I want to start by talking about something Carl Jung said. this is a quote by him, that nothing is true without its exact opposite also being true. Nothing is true without its exact opposite also being true. And what he meant by that is that if somebody has a particular value that's very, very important for them, then the opposite of that value, exact opposite of that value, is also a very, very important criterion for them. So for example, if somebody says honesty is very important for me, then they are capable of behaving in a very dishonest fashion. And he arrived at this conclusion through some kind of a logic, which I personally do not agree with. I will tell you, I agree with something about shadow values, but not exactly his version. He said that, say, for example, somebody comes to a fork in the road in life, and they can either choose to be honest or they can choose to be dishonest. For example, they cross a red light, a policeman flags them down, and they can either give a bribe to the policeman or not give a bribe. Let's say they choose honesty. Okay? Then second time something else happens at work, they come back from travels and they have to fill out a reimbursement form, and they can either claim more than they actually spent or they can claim exactly as much as they spent. Again, they choose honesty. So Carl Jung asked this question, what happened to the dishonest choice? Did it disappear? He said no, it's actually inside the person and it is going to come out at some other point in time. That was his version of what happens. Now my version of shadow values is a little bit different. My version is along these lines. It is that if some value is very, very important to you, so for example, I'll give my own example of compassion. It's very, very important to me. It's not as if lack of compassion or the opposite of compassion, which may be hatred or not being nice to people, I don't think that is my shadow value. My shadow value is that I am not very compassionate to people who are not very compassionate. Does it make sense? That I kind of look for signs of how compassionate or not compassionate somebody is, and I pass a judgment on people who I believe to be not very compassionate. And that's not necessarily a good thing, because my compassion has to be so big that it embraces the whole universe. That's what I want ultimately. And this stops me from achieving that. So in my version of shadow values, if you think about a kind of physical representation of this idea, so you think of your value as a pillar, a tall pillar, and the more important the value is, the taller that pillar is, it casts a shadow. And the shadow is going to be more or less equal to the size and the height of that pillar, of how important that value is. And the shadow that it casts is going to differ by people. For somebody else who has the same compassion value, maybe the shadow value is not being close to non-givers or non-compassionate people. Maybe it's actually hatred. Who knows? Okay? But it really depends on the angle of the sun. For me, the angle of the sun casts this shadow value of being close to non-givers. I'll give you another example, rationality. For me, rationality is very, very important. And of course, it is because perhaps I'm a professor. We have to think through things. We can't depend only on faith. We can't depend on our personal experiences. We have to look at the data. We have to come at conclusions that are logical, that are backed up by evidence, and that can be replicated by other scientists. So this is very consistent with my job to have this rationality as a value, but the shadow that it casts is that I'm often what might be called mind addicted. I don't know how many of you guys suffer from the same affliction. What I mean by mind addicted is that sometimes when something wrong happens, I have to get to the bottom of it, and I have to get to it right now. And I can't sleep unless I get to the bottom of it. And I spend a lot of time thinking about it. I think an underlying assumption for people who are mind addicted is that you can arrive at a better solution to any problem if only you can think a little more about it. Okay? That you think that if only I think a little more, if only I kind of look at the whole problem again from start, why it happened, who caused it, what can I do, etc. If I just analyze, maybe overanalyze, I will come to a better solution to the problem. When in reality, a lot of research shows that sometimes it's better to go with your gut feeling. Sometimes it's better to go with your gut feeling to arrive at a good solution to a problem. And oftentimes, there are problems that have to do with interactions with other fellow human beings, and sometimes it's better to not overthink it. You guys agree with me? Yeah? There's actually a lot of research on this by a Dutch psychologist called Ap Dijksterhuis. I think I'm pronouncing his name right, AP, and then there's a long long second name, Dijkstra House. So he's done a lot of work on it, and what he finds is that for people who are experts in a particular domain, let's for example think of an expert in marketing, right? For them, it's better to sometimes go with the gut feel that this advertisement, somehow, I don't know why, it's going to work really well. They have a lot of expertise and their knowledge has been crystallized into a gut feeling, and it's better to go with the gut feel. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a really good book on this topic called Blink that I would highly recommend to you if you're interested in the topic. But anyway, I suffer from this particular shadow value of being mind addicted sometimes, which I'm trying to work on, of course. The third example, freedom seeking. So sometimes that leads me to be not so disciplined. My desire to be free, to be not controlled by anybody, by authority figures, makes me do things that sometimes can be not very disciplined. And sometimes it leads me into a little bit of trouble. Okay? So those are my values and shadow values, and I want you to work on your own values and shadow values. I want to talk to you a little bit about why shadow values and values are important for happiness, and then I'm going to let you discuss with a new partner. Try to find somebody new so that you can get to know other people in this wonderful gathering, so that we can actually be closer to this family that I talked about. Okay, so here are the reasons why values and shadow values are important. So research shows that alignment of your values with your organization's values is one of the biggest determinants of your happiness. If you're working for a company that's not aligned with your values, then you're not going to be very happy. So for example, people who really want to do good for the world, contribute to the world, if they're working for a cigarette manufacturer like Philip Morris, they're probably not going to be very, very happy. Okay? It might seem like an obvious thing, but many of my students don't even think about this when they apply for jobs. They go for the highest paying job or the most prestigious job or the job that everybody else seems to be applying for without actually stepping back a little bit and thinking about, okay, what are my values? Okay, nobody's done this exercise. Again, think about this definition of brilliant, right? That it's common sense, but it's not commonplace. It's not common practice. Okay? How many of you guys have actually taken time to figure out your values before this? Okay? Wow, that's pretty impressive. Maybe about 10 hands are going up. But again, even in this crowd, which is quite self-aware, it turns out that maybe 90% haven't done this. If you don't know your values, then you don't know what your anchors are. You don't know what's your true north, as somebody put it, right? Okay, so more important than that even is the awareness of shadow values. It's very, very critical for this idea of personal mastery, which is mastery over your own emotions. Why? Because if you're in a situation where your shadow values are triggered, you're going to have a disproportionately high negative reaction. I'll give you an example of my father. My father is a stickler for honesty. He's a stickler for honesty because he grew up in India, which is not a very honest place. There's a lot of bribery going around. He would never do it. Okay, he would never do it, but his honesty value is so high that seeing any exhibitions of dishonesty, even if he's not involved in it directly, evokes this disproportionately large reaction in him. Once we were going on a vacation, driving in the car, and he saw a driver paying a bribe to a policeman. And that just set him off completely. It was like a bomb going off in the car, right? He went there and he actually got out of the car and slapped the policeman. Okay, and the guy who was bribing him, he came to intervene and he slapped that guy too. In the end, my father had to go to jail for one day. Yes, yeah, he had to go to jail in the end. Okay, so that is the thing, that the shadow values, if your values are very high, your shadow values are going to be very deep. And those are very, very important to recognize because they can actually disturb your equanimity. For many people who have honesty as a value, perhaps seeing dishonesty may not be your shadow value, having this reaction, but maybe it's bluntness, right? Because honesty is so important to you, you're always going to speak the truth at all times, when that may not be necessary. Maybe you should be quiet. So if honesty is a big value for my father, if my mother comes dressed in a new sari, you know what sari is? This really pretty attire, and she's just bought it and she's very excited by it, and she shows off to my dad walking down the steps, hey, how's this? And because honesty is such a big value for him, he'll say, I don't like it. Okay, and she's just bought it and she's decided in her head she's going to wear it. And the best thing to do here is to actually say, that's very good. Even if you're lying, I think, because compassion for me is a bigger value than honesty. And I've realized after 18 years of marriage that sometimes in marriage you can be right or you can be happy. You can't be both. Right? Maybe it's a more practical approach because practicality is another value of mine. Anyway, so understanding your shadow values is very, very important for personal mastery, for understanding what kinds of situations are likely to set off this time bomb inside your head and make you have a disproportionately negative reaction to situations.